The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a breathtaking array of oranges and reds that would have been beautiful if not for the menacing glow of the approaching wildfire. Evelyn Matthews stood at her kitchen window, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the distant flames creep closer to her beloved home in the outskirts of Redwood, California. At 48 years old, Evelyn had weathered many storms in her life, but nothing could have prepared her for the inferno that threatened to consume everything she held dear. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, seeping through the cracks of the old farmhouse that had been in her family for generations. Evelyn's eyes stung, and she blinked back tears, uncertain if they were from the smoke or the overwhelming emotions that threatened to consume her. The distant roar of the flames grew louder with each passing minute, a constant reminder of the danger that loomed ever closer. With trembling hands, Evelyn began to gather her most cherished possessions. Family photos, her grandmother's antique locket, and the journal she'd kept since childhood found their way into a worn leather backpack. Each item held a story, a memory that Evelyn couldn't bear to lose to the flames. As she moved through the house, her faithful companion, Sunny, a golden retriever with a heart as big as the California sky, followed close at her heels. Sunny's presence was a comfort in the chaos, his warm brown eyes watching Evelyn's every move with unwavering loyalty. The dog seemed to sense the urgency in her movements, staying close but never getting in the way. Occasionally, he would nudge her leg gently, as if to remind her that he was there, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. As Evelyn zipped up the backpack, her gaze fell on the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was taken just last Christmas, Evelyn, her sister Sarah, and their parents, all smiling brightly against a backdrop of twinkling lights and evergreen boughs. The thought of leaving behind these tangible memories made Evelyn's chest tighten with grief. But she knew that the most important things, the love and bonds they shared, couldn't be touched by any fire. The crackle of flames grew louder, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window once more. The fire was now visible from her front porch, a wall of orange and red that devoured everything in its path. The trees at the edge of her property, which had stood tall and proud for decades, were now silhouettes against the inferno, their branches reaching out like desperate, gnarled fingers. A wave of panic washed over Evelyn. How had the fire moved so quickly? The evacuation order had come only hours ago, and she had thought she had more time. The sound of breaking glass somewhere in the house snapped her back to reality. They needed to leave, now. "Sunny, come," Evelyn called, her voice hoarse from the smoke. The golden retriever was at her side in an instant, his tail low but his stance alert. Evelyn grabbed the emergency bag she had packed weeks ago when the first whispers of fire season had begun to circulate. It contained water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, and other essentials she hoped she'd never need to use. With one last glance around the home that held a lifetime of memories, Evelyn opened the front door. The heat hit her like a physical force, causing her to stumble back a step. Sunny pressed against her leg, steadying her, his furry body an anchor in the chaos. "We can do this, boy," Evelyn murmured, more to herself than to the dog. Taking a deep breath that filled her lungs with smoke, she stepped out into the night. The world outside was a hellscape. The once familiar landscape of her property was transformed into a nightmarish tableau of smoke and flame. The old oak tree where Evelyn had played as a child was now engulfed, its branches crackling and popping as the fire consumed it. The shed where her father had taught her to change a tire was already gone, reduced to a smoldering heap of twisted metal and ash. Evelyn and Sunny made their way down the gravel driveway, the stones crunching under their feet. The heat pressed against them from all sides, and Evelyn could feel sweat beading on her forehead and running down her back. Sunny stayed close, his fur brushing against her leg with each step, a constant reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. As they reached the end of the driveway, Evelyn's old pickup truck came into view. For a moment, hope surged within her. If they could make it to the truck, they might have a chance of outrunning the fire. But as they drew closer, Evelyn's heart sank. The tires had melted from the intense heat, the rubber pooling on the ground like black tears. "No, no, no," Evelyn muttered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the approaching flames. She looked down at Sunny, who gazed back at her with trusting eyes. "Looks like we're on foot, buddy." They turned toward the main road, but the sight that greeted them made Evelyn's blood run cold. A wall of flame had leapt across the asphalt, cutting off their escape route. The fire had outflanked them, its hunger insatiable as it devoured everything in its path. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to recall the evacuation routes they had discussed in community meetings. But the smoke was so thick now, obscuring landmarks and making it impossible to get her bearings. She coughed violently, her lungs burning with each breath. Sunny whined softly, pressing closer to her side. "We can't stay here," Evelyn said, her voice rough. She looked around frantically, searching for any path that wasn't blocked by fire. To their left, she spotted a gap in the flames, a narrow corridor that led towards the creek that ran along the edge of her property. Without hesitation, Evelyn began to move towards the opening, Sunny keeping pace beside her. The heat was almost unbearable now, and Evelyn could feel her skin tightening from the intensity. She pulled the collar of her shirt up over her nose and mouth in a futile attempt to filter the smoke. As they stumbled through the gap in the flames, Evelyn's foot caught on a fallen branch. She pitched forward, crying out as she hit the ground hard. Pain shot through her ankle, and for a terrifying moment, she wasn't sure if she could get up. Sunny barked urgently, nudging at her shoulder. Evelyn gritted her teeth and pushed herself to her feet, leaning heavily on her good leg. The pain was intense, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins helped her push through it. They pressed on towards the creek, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they approached. Evelyn's vision blurred, whether from tears or the thick smoke, she couldn't tell. Each step was a struggle, her injured ankle threatening to give way beneath her. Finally, they reached the bank of the creek. The water level was low due to the drought, but it still offered a barrier against the encroaching flames. Evelyn stumbled into the shallow water, the cool liquid a sharp contrast to the searing heat that surrounded them. Sunny splashed in after her, his golden fur darkened by soot and water. Evelyn sank to her knees in the creek bed, the water coming up to her waist. She cupped her hands, bringing the water to her parched lips and then splashing some on her face. As the water washed away some of the grime and cooled her burning skin, Evelyn felt a moment of clarity. They couldn't stay here. The fire would eventually jump the creek, and they needed to keep moving. But which way? The smoke was so thick now that she could barely see a few feet in front of her. Sunny barked again, this time with a different tone. Evelyn looked up to see the dog staring intently downstream. In the distance, she could just make out the faint wail of sirens. "Good boy, Sunny," Evelyn said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Let's go." With renewed determination, Evelyn pushed herself to her feet. The pain in her ankle was still there, but she forced herself to ignore it. Keeping one hand on Sunny's back for support and balance, she began to make her way downstream, towards the sound of the sirens and the hope of rescue. As they moved through the water, Evelyn's thoughts turned to her neighbors, her friends, her community. How many others were out here, trying to escape the inferno? Had everyone made it out safely? The weight of worry pressed down on her, almost as suffocating as the smoke that swirled around them. But with each step, with each splash of water beneath their feet, Evelyn and Sunny moved further from the heart of the fire. The roar of the flames began to fade, replaced by the increasing volume of sirens. Hope, as fragile as a butterfly's wing, began to flutter in Evelyn's chest. They rounded a bend in the creek, and suddenly, through a break in the smoke, Evelyn saw flashing lights. Red and blue cut through the haze, and she could make out the shapes of fire trucks and emergency vehicles. "Help!" Evelyn cried out, her voice hoarse but fueled by desperate hope. "We're here. Please, help us." Sunny joined in, his bark echoing across the water. And then, like an answer to a prayer, a flashlight beam cut through the smoke, landing on Evelyn and her faithful companion. "We've got survivors," a voice called out. "Over here, in the creek." As the firefighters made their way towards them, Evelyn felt her legs give way. She sank back into the water, overcome with relief and exhaustion. Sunny stayed by her side, his tail wagging weakly as the rescuers approached. In the chaos of the moment, as hands reached out to help them from the creek, Evelyn hugged Sunny close. "We made it, boy," she whispered into his smoky fur. "We made it." The night was far from over, and the fire still raged, but Evelyn and Sunny had survived the worst of it. As they were led to safety, Evelyn knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The road to recovery would be long, but with Sunny by her side and the strength of her community behind her, Evelyn felt ready to meet whatever came next. The firefighters wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and as she was guided towards an ambulance, Evelyn took one last look back at the inferno that had nearly claimed them. The flames still lit up the night sky, a reminder of nature's awesome and terrible power. But here, safe with Sunny and surrounded by the brave men and women who had come to their aid, Evelyn felt a flicker of something else, the unquenchable spirit of resilience that would see them through this disaster and beyond. The ambulance's flashing lights cut through the thick smoke as Evelyn and Sunny were guided towards it. Evelyn's legs trembled with each step, the adrenaline that had fueled their escape now fading, leaving her exhausted and acutely aware of the pain in her ankle. Sunny stayed close, his fur matted with soot and creek water, but his eyes remained alert, watching every move of the firefighters and paramedics surrounding them. We need to get you to the evacuation center," a young paramedic said, his face streaked with sweat and ash. "Can you tell me your name?" "Evelyn," she managed to croak out, her throat raw from the smoke. "Evelyn Matthews. And this is Sunny," she added, gesturing to her loyal companion. The paramedic nodded, jotting down the information on a clipboard. "Okay, Evelyn. We're going to take care of you both. Let's get you into the ambulance." As they approached the vehicle, Evelyn suddenly stopped, her heart racing. "Wait," she said, turning to look back at the firefighters battling the blaze. "My neighbors, the Johnsons, the Garcias, have they made it out?" The paramedic's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, I don't have that information. But I can assure you that our teams are doing everything they can to evacuate everyone in the area." Evelyn nodded, fighting back tears. The thought of her friends and neighbors still trapped in the inferno was almost too much to bear. She allowed herself to be helped into the ambulance, Sunny jumping in after her without prompting. As the doors closed and the vehicle began to move, Evelyn got her first clear view of the devastation. Through the rear windows, she could see the angry red glow of the fire stretching across the horizon, consuming everything in its path. The familiar landscape of her community was transformed into a hellscape of smoke and flame. The ambulance wound its way through streets clogged with evacuees and emergency vehicles. Evelyn watched as families huddled together in cars packed with hastily gathered belongings, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. The scene outside was chaotic, with police officers directing traffic and firefighters racing towards the advancing fire line. "How bad is it?" Evelyn asked the paramedic who was checking her vitals. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's one of the worst fires we've seen in years. The drought has made everything like tinder. We're doing our best, but..." His voice trailed off, but Evelyn understood. The situation was dire, and there was no guarantee that anything would be left when the flames finally died down. As they drove, Evelyn's thoughts turned to her sister, Sarah, who lived in the neighboring town of Pine Grove. Had the fire reached there too? She fumbled for her phone, only to realize it must have fallen out during their frantic escape through the creek. "Do you have a phone I could use?" she asked the paramedic. "I need to check on my sister." He handed her his cell phone, and Evelyn dialed Sarah's number with shaky fingers. The call went straight to voicemail. Evelyn left a brief message, trying to keep the panic out of her voice as she explained what had happened and asked Sarah to call her back. The drive to the evacuation center seemed to take hours, though in reality it was probably no more than 20 minutes. Every few moments, Evelyn would crane her neck to look out the window, watching as the glow of the fire receded into the distance. Sunny lay his head on her lap, his warm presence a comfort in the midst of the chaos. Finally, the ambulance pulled into the parking lot of the Redwood High School, which had been converted into an emergency shelter. The scene outside was one of organized chaos, with volunteers in bright vests directing new arrivals and distributing supplies. As Evelyn was helped out of the ambulance, the full impact of the night's events hit her. She stumbled, overwhelmed by a wave of dizziness and emotion. Sunny whined softly, pressing against her leg to steady her. "Easy there," the paramedic said, supporting her. "Let's get you inside and checked out properly." They made their way through the crowd towards the school's gymnasium. Inside, the large space was filled with rows of cots and makeshift medical stations. The air was thick with tension and the murmur of worried voices. Evelyn was led to one of the medical stations, where a tired-looking doctor examined her ankle and checked her for smoke inhalation. Sonny sat patiently by the cot, his eyes never leaving Evelyn. "You've got a mild sprain," the doctor said, wrapping Evelyn's ankle. "And your lungs sound a bit irritated from the smoke, but nothing too serious. You're lucky." Lucky. The word echoed in Evelyn's mind. Was she lucky? Her home was probably gone, her community in flames, and she had no idea if her friends and neighbors were safe. But then she looked down at Sonny, who gazed back at her with unwavering loyalty, and she realized that yes, in many ways, she was indeed lucky. After being given some water and a change of clothes donated by local charities, Evelyn made her way to the main area of the gymnasium. Volunteers were setting up cots and distributing blankets to the steady stream of evacuees entering the shelter. Evelyn found an empty cot in a corner and sat down heavily, Sonny curling up at her feet. She looked around at the faces of her fellow evacuees, some she recognized, others were strangers. All shared the same shell-shocked expression, the disbelief that their lives had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. A young volunteer approached, carrying a clipboard. "Excuse me, We're trying to account for everyone. Could you give me your name and address?" Evelyn provided the information, then asked, "Is there any news about Oak Ridge Road?" "That's where I lived," she corrected herself, the reality of her situation sinking in. The volunteer's face fell. "I'm sorry, but last I heard, Oak Ridge Road was directly in the fire's path. We don't have any specific information yet, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Evelyn nodded, thanking him quietly. As he moved on to the next person, she buried her face in her hands, allowing herself a moment of grief for the home she'd likely lost. Sonny nudged her gently, and Evelyn reached down to scratch behind his ears. "What are we going to do, boy?" she whispered. As the night wore on, more evacuees arrived at the shelter. Evelyn watched as families were reunited, tears of relief mixing with the lingering fear and uncertainty. She kept an eye out for familiar faces, her heart lifting whenever she recognized a neighbor or friend. Around midnight, a commotion near the entrance caught Evelyn's attention. A group of firefighters had arrived, their faces blackened with soot, their expressions grim. They huddled with the shelter coordinators, speaking in low, urgent tones. Whispers began to spread through the gymnasium. The fire had jumped the main highway. 2 more neighborhoods were being evacuated. The wind had shifted, driving the flames towards Pine Grove. Pine Grove. Sarah's town. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of panic. She stood up, wincing at the pain in her ankle, and made her way towards the group of firefighters. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Is it true about Pine Grove? Is it being evacuated?" One of the firefighters turned to her, his eyes softening with sympathy. "Yes, The evacuation order just went out. They're setting up another shelter at the community college there." Evelyn's mind raced. She had to get to Sarah, to make sure she was safe. But how? She had no car, no phone, and the roads were likely clogged with evacuees and emergency vehicles. As if sensing her distress, Sonny pressed against her leg, looking up at her with those soulful brown eyes. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She couldn't rush off half-cocked, she needed a plan. She made her way back to her cot, Sonny following closely. Sitting down, she tried to think logically. Sarah was smart and capable. She would have heard the evacuation order and would be on her way to safety. The best thing Evelyn could do now was stay put and try to make contact. With renewed determination, Evelyn stood up and scanned the gymnasium. Near the entrance, she spotted a table with a sign reading Emergency Communications. Perfect. As she approached the table, she overheard snippets of conversations around her. People were sharing stories of narrow escapes, worrying about homes and possessions left behind, and speculating about when they might be able to return. "Excuse me," Evelyn said to the volunteer at the communications table. "I'm trying to reach my sister in Pine Grove. Is there any way I can get a message to her?" The volunteer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, nodded. "We're coordinating with the other evacuation centers. What's your sister's name?" "Sarah Matthews," Evelyn replied. "She lives on Elm Street in Pine Grove." The volunteer jotted down the information. I'll put this in our system. If she checks in at any of the shelters, we'll let her know you're safe and try to put you in touch. Evelyn thanked her, feeling a small measure of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she turned to go back to her cot, she nearly collided with a familiar face. Mrs. Garcia, Evelyn exclaimed, recognizing her neighbor from 2 doors down. The older woman's face lit up with recognition. Evelyn. Oh, thank God you're all right. We were so worried when we didn't see you at the roadblock. They embraced, the shared experience of the night's terror creating a bond that transcended their previous casual acquaintance. Have you heard anything about our street? Evelyn asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Mrs. Garcia's expression grew somber. Nothing definite, but Roberto, you know he volunteers with the fire department. He heard that the fire reached Oak Ridge Road about an hour after we evacuated. It's not good, Evelyn. The news, while not unexpected, hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, and Sonny immediately pressed against her, offering silent support. Mrs. Garcia placed a comforting hand on Evelyn's arm. But we're alive, dear. That's what matters. Everything else, well, we'll face that together, as a community. Evelyn nodded, forcing back tears. You're right. Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. I'm glad you and your family are safe. As Mrs. Garcia moved on to check on other neighbors, Evelyn made her way back to her cot. The weight of the night's events pressed down on her, and she felt utterly drained. She lay down, and Sonny immediately jumped up to curl beside her, his warm presence a much-needed comfort. As Evelyn drifted into an uneasy sleep, her mind swirled with images of flame and smoke, of the home she'd likely lost and the uncertain future ahead. But even in the depths of her exhaustion and worry, she felt a flicker of something else, a determination to face whatever came next, to help rebuild her community, and to find a way forward. With Sonny by her side and the strength of her neighbors around her, Evelyn knew that somehow, they would get through this. As she finally succumbed to sleep, her hand resting on Sonny's fur, the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the gymnasium windows, bringing with it the promise of a new day and the challenges it would bring. The harsh fluorescent lights of the gymnasium flickered, jolting Evelyn from her fitful sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a surge of panic. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Sonny, ever vigilant, lifted his head from where he lay curled against her side, his brown eyes full of concern. It's okay, boy, Evelyn murmured, running her hand through his smoky fur. We're safe. As she sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles and the throbbing pain in her ankle, Evelyn took stock of her surroundings. The gymnasium was a hive of activity, even in the early morning hours. Volunteers moved between cots, distributing water and snacks, while harried-looking officials huddled in corners, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Evelyn's stomach growled, reminding her that it had been hours since she'd last eaten. She stood carefully, testing her injured ankle, and Sonny immediately rose to stand beside her, ready to offer support if needed. As they made their way towards a table laden with donated food, Evelyn couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from her fellow evacuees. The news wasn't good. The fire had continued to spread overnight, defying the firefighters' best efforts to contain it. More neighborhoods had been evacuated, and there were rumors of entire towns being consumed by the inferno. Evelyn's thoughts turned once again to her sister Sarah. Had she made it to safety? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a constant worry in the back of her mind. After grabbing a bottle of water and a granola bar, Evelyn headed towards the communications table she'd visited the night before. The same kind-eyed volunteer was there, looking tired but determined. Any news about my sister? Evelyn asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Sarah Matthews, from Pine Grove? The volunteer checked her lists and shook her head. I'm sorry, no check-ins under that name yet. But don't worry, she added quickly, seeing the fear in Evelyn's eyes. We're still getting updates from the other shelters. I'll let you know the moment we hear anything. Evelyn nodded, forcing a smile of thanks even as her heart sank. She turned away, unsure of what to do next, when a commotion near the gymnasium entrance caught her attention. A group of firefighters had just entered, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. Among them was a familiar face, Jake, the young firefighter who had helped rescue her and Sunny the night before. Without thinking, Evelyn made her way towards them, Sunny trotting faithfully by her side. As she approached, she could hear snippets of their conversation. "Never seen anything like it," one of the older firefighters was saying, shaking his head. "It's like the whole world's on fire out there." Jake noticed Evelyn and Sunny approaching and broke away from the group. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, a tired smile crossing his face. "Glad to see you're okay. How's the ankle?" "It's seen better days," Evelyn admitted. "But we're managing." How bad is it out there?" Jake's expression grew serious. "It's rough. The fire jumped the containment lines overnight. We're doing everything we can, but with this drought and the winds." He trailed off, running a hand through his ash-streaked hair. Evelyn was about to ask more when suddenly, Sunny's ears perked up. The golden retriever let out a sharp bark, his tail wagging furiously as he looked towards the gymnasium entrance. "Sunny, what is it, boy?" Evelyn asked, puzzled by her dog's sudden excitement. Before anyone could react, Sunny took off running towards the doors, barking loudly. Evelyn called after him, but the dog was on a mission, weaving between startled evacuees and volunteers. "Sunny, come back," Evelyn shouted, limping after him as fast as her injured ankle would allow. Jake, seeing her struggle, quickly moved to help her. As they neared the entrance, they saw what had caught Sunny's attention. A group of newly arrived evacuees was being ushered in, looking shell-shocked and covered in ash. Among them was a familiar face that made Evelyn's heart leap. "Sarah," she cried out, relief flooding through her. Her sister turned at the sound of her name, her eyes widening in recognition. "Evelyn? Oh my God, Evelyn!" The two sisters rushed towards each other, embracing tightly as Sunny danced around their feet, barking joyfully. Tears streamed down both their faces as they held each other, the fear and uncertainty of the past hours giving way to profound relief. "I was so worried," Evelyn sobbed, pulling back to look at her sister. Sarah's face was smudged with soot, her clothes smelling of smoke, but she was alive and whole. "When I couldn't reach you, and then I heard Pine Grove was being evacuated." Sarah nodded, her own eyes brimming with tears. "It was chaos. The fire came so fast. We barely had time to grab anything before we had to run. I've been trying to find you since we got the evacuation order, but with the roads blocked and the phones down." As the sisters talked, filling each other in on their harrowing experiences, Jake watched with a small smile. It was moments like these, reunions in the midst of disaster, that reminded him why he became a firefighter. Suddenly, Jake's radio crackled to life. "All available units, we need immediate backup on the eastern flank. The fire's jumped the highway and is approaching Redwood Hospital. Evacuation in progress." Jake's face paled. The hospital. There were hundreds of people there, many of whom couldn't evacuate on their own. Without a word, he turned and sprinted towards the exit, calling for his team to regroup. Evelyn, overhearing the call, felt a chill run down her spine. "The hospital," she whispered. "All those people." Sarah squeezed her hand. "They'll get them out. They have to." But as they watched the firefighters rush out, the gravity of the situation settled over everyone in the gymnasium. The fire was far from over, and more lives were at stake with each passing minute. Outside, Jake and his team raced towards their trucks. The young firefighter's mind was racing, going over evacuation protocols and trying to calculate how many people they'd need to move. As he climbed into the fire engine, he caught sight of something that made him pause. Sunny, the golden retriever who had been so instrumental in Evelyn's rescue, was running towards the trucks, barking urgently. "Sunny, no." Jake heard Evelyn's voice calling from the gymnasium entrance. She was limping towards them, her sister supporting her. Without thinking, Jake jumped down from the truck and scooped up the dog. "It's okay, boy," he said, even as Sunny squirmed in his arms, still barking. "You've done your part. Let us handle this now." He carried Sunny back to Evelyn, who took the dog with a grateful look. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know what got into him." Jake managed a small smile. "He's a hero, that's what." But this isn't a job for dogs, no matter how brave they are. As he turned to go, Evelyn called out, "Be careful out there." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "We will. You all stay safe here." With that, he ran back to the truck. Moments later, the fire engines roared to life, sirens wailing as they sped off towards the hospital. Evelyn, Sarah, and Sunny watched them go, a sense of helplessness settling over them. The sisters made their way back into the gymnasium, where the atmosphere had grown tense with the news of the fire's latest advance. "What can we do?" Sarah asked, looking around at the scared and weary faces of their fellow evacuees. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. "We can help here," she said with determination. "There are people who need food, comfort, someone to talk to. We can do that." Sarah nodded, a small smile breaking through her worried expression. "You're right. Let's get to work." For the next few hours, the sisters threw themselves into helping wherever they could. Evelyn, despite her injured ankle, helped distribute supplies and offered words of comfort to scared children and worried parents. Sarah, who had some medical training, assisted the overwhelmed nurses in treating minor injuries and checking on the elderly evacuees. Sunny, for his part, seemed to know exactly who needed him most. The gentle dog moved from person to person, offering a furry head to pat or a warm body to hug. His presence brought smiles to tear-stained faces and calmed panicked breaths. As the day wore on, news trickled in from the outside. The firefighters had managed to evacuate the hospital in time, though it had been a close call. The fire continued to rage, but there were signs that the wind was starting to shift, potentially giving the firefighters a chance to gain ground. It was late afternoon when Jake and his team returned to the shelter. They looked exhausted, their uniforms even more smoke-stained than before, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Evelyn, who had been helping serve food, made her way over to them. "How bad is it?" she asked, bracing herself for the worst. Jake took a deep breath. "It's been tough," he admitted. "But we're starting to see some progress. The wind's shifting in our favor, and we've got more air support coming in. It's not over yet, but I think we might be turning a corner." A ripple of cautious optimism spread through the gymnasium as word of Jake's update circulated. For the first time since the evacuation, people began to speak of when they might return home, rather than if. As evening approached, Evelyn found herself sitting on a cot with Sarah and Sunny, sharing a simple meal of sandwiches and fruit. The sisters talked quietly, piecing together their experiences and marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them back together. "I can't believe Sunny knew you were here," Evelyn said, scratching behind her dog's ears. "It's like he sensed you somehow." Sarah smiled, reaching out to pat Sunny's head. "He's always been special. Remember when we were kids, how he always knew when one of us was upset?" Evelyn nodded, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. "He's been my rock through all of this," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without him." As night fell, the gymnasium settled into a subdued quiet. The immediate crisis had passed, but uncertainty still hung in the air. What would they find when they were finally allowed to return home? How would they rebuild their lives from the ashes of the fire? Evelyn lay on her cot, Sunny curled up at her feet, and stared at the ceiling. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Her mind raced with questions about the future, worries about friends and neighbors she hadn't yet accounted for, and a deep, aching sadness for all that had been lost. But as she listened to the soft breathing of her sister on the neighboring cot and felt the comforting weight of Sunny against her legs, Evelyn also felt a flicker of hope. They had survived the worst of the fire. They were together. And somehow, they would find a way to move forward. With that thought, Evelyn finally drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on Sunny's fur. Outside, the glow of the fire had dimmed, and the first stars of the night peeked through the smoke-filled sky, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light would always find a way to shine through. The days following the wildfire blurred together in a haze of smoke and exhaustion. Evelyn, Sarah, and Sunny remained at the evacuation center, along with hundreds of other displaced residents, as firefighters continued their relentless battle against the inferno. The gymnasium that had become their temporary home buzzed with a mixture of anxiety, hope, and resilience. On the third day after their evacuation, a tentative cheer went up in the shelter. The fire was finally contained. Evelyn hugged Sarah tightly, tears of relief streaming down both their faces. Sonny, sensing the shift in mood, wagged his tail and let out a joyful bark. However, the news of containment was bittersweet. While the immediate danger had passed, the true extent of the devastation was only beginning to come to light. As evacuees gathered around hastily set up televisions and radios, the magnitude of their loss became painfully clear. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. Familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by a desolate, charred landscape. The local news showed aerial footage of the affected areas, and Evelyn felt her heart sink as she recognized what remained of Oak Ridge Road, her street, her home. "Oh, Evelyn," Sarah whispered, squeezing her sister's hand as they watched the footage. "I'm so sorry." Evelyn nodded silently, unable to find words. Sonny, ever attuned to her emotions, pressed his head against her leg, offering silent comfort. As the day wore on, local officials began the monumental task of coordinating the return of residents to the affected areas. It was a slow, careful process. Some neighborhoods were deemed safe for immediate return, while others remained off-limits due to ongoing safety concerns. Evelyn and Sarah's area, including Oak Ridge Road, fell into the latter category. The devastation was too severe, the risk of unstable structures and hidden hotspots too great. It would be at least another week before they could go back. Go back to what? Evelyn wasn't sure she wanted to know. In the meantime, the sisters threw themselves into volunteer work at the shelter. Evelyn, her ankle now much improved, helped with food distribution and acted as a listening ear for fellow evacuees who needed to talk. Sarah, with her medical background, continued to assist the overwhelmed medical staff. Sonny, for his part, became something of a celebrity in the shelter. Word of his heroic actions during the evacuation had spread, and many found comfort in the presence of the gentle golden retriever. Children especially were drawn to him, and Evelyn often found Sonny surrounded by small hands petting his fur, his tail wagging contentedly. One afternoon, as Evelyn was sorting through donated clothes, she heard a familiar voice call her name. She looked up to see Jake, the young firefighter who had been so instrumental in their rescue, walking towards her. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, a tired smile on his face. "How are you holding up?" Evelyn managed a small smile in return. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. How about you? You must be exhausted." Jake nodded, running a hand through his hair. "It's been tough," he admitted. "But we're making progress. I actually came to give you some news. They've cleared your street for resident return tomorrow." Evelyn felt her heart skip a beat. Tomorrow. She would see her home, or what was left of it, tomorrow. The reality of it hit her like a physical force, and she swayed slightly on her feet. Jake reached out to steady her. "Are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" Evelyn shook her head, taking a deep breath. "No, I'm all right. Thank you, Jake, for everything you've done." The young firefighter's face softened. "Just doing my job, but I'm glad I could help." As Jake moved on to inform other residents, Evelyn sought out Sarah and Sonny. She found them in a quiet corner of the gymnasium, Sarah reading a book while Sonny dozed at her feet. "We can go back tomorrow," Evelyn said without preamble as she sat down next to her sister. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. "Tomorrow? Are you sure you're ready?" Evelyn shrugged, absently stroking Sonny's fur. "Ready or not, I need to see it. To know." The sisters spent the rest of the day preparing for their return. They gathered what few possessions they had, the clothes on their backs, the emergency supplies they'd grabbed during evacuation, and a few donated items they'd acquired at the shelter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, sleep eluded Evelyn. She lay on her cot, staring at the gymnasium ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities of what the morning would bring. Would there be anything left of her home? Of the life she'd built? Beside her, Sonny slept peacefully, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet night. As dawn broke, Evelyn, Sarah, and Sonny joined a group of residents preparing to return to their neighborhoods. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of anticipation and dread. Buses had been arranged to transport them, as many had lost their vehicles in the fire. The ride was somber, the usual chatter of a bus ride replaced by a heavy silence. As they entered the affected area, gasps and muffled sobs filled the air. The landscape was almost unrecognizable. Charred trees stood like skeletal sentinels along the road, their bare branches reaching towards a sky still hazy with smoke. When they reached Oakridge Road, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The street she had called home for over 2 decades was a wasteland of ash and debris. Houses that had stood for generations were now nothing more than blackened foundations and twisted metal. The bus came to a stop, and the passengers began to disembark. Evelyn hesitated, suddenly unsure if she could face what lay beyond the bus doors. Sarah squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We'll do this together," she said softly. With Sonny leading the way, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents of ash and char, the sisters stepped off the bus. The heat from the ground seeped through their shoes, a reminder of the inferno that had swept through just days before. They made their way down the street, past the ruins of their neighbors' homes. Mrs. Garcia's beautiful rose garden was now a patch of scorched earth. The old oak tree where neighborhood kids had played for generations was a blackened husk. And then, they were there, standing before what remained of Evelyn's home. The 2-story farmhouse that had been in her family for generations was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble and ash. The porch swing where she had spent countless evenings was nowhere to be seen. The flower boxes her mother had lovingly tended were obliterated. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to process the scene before her. Sarah wrapped an arm around her shoulders, her own tears falling silently. Sonny whined softly, pressing against Evelyn's leg. As the initial shock began to wear off, Evelyn took a tentative step forward. Then another. She found herself picking through the debris, searching for anything that might have survived the inferno. In what had once been the living room, she spotted a glint of metal. Kneeling down, heedless of the ash staining her clothes, she carefully brushed away the soot. Her breath caught as she recognized the object, her grandmother's locket, tarnished but intact. "Oh, Evelyn," Sarah said, kneeling beside her. "It's a miracle." Evelyn clutched the locket to her chest, a tangible link to her past amidst the devastation. As she looked around at the ruins of her home, a strange calm settled over her. Yes, she had lost so much. But she was alive. She had Sarah, she had Sonny. And now, she had this small piece of her history to carry forward. As the day wore on, more residents returned to Oakridge Road. The street became a hub of activity, insurance adjusters taking notes, utility workers assessing damage, volunteers offering water and support to shell-shocked homeowners. Evelyn, Sarah, and Sonny stayed at the property until the sun began to set. They had salvaged what little they could, the locket, a few scorched photos, a miraculously intact photo album that had been protected by a fallen chunk of drywall. It wasn't much, but it was something to build upon. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn took one last look at the place she had called home for so long. The devastation was overwhelming, but as she watched her neighbors comforting each other, sharing stories and offering help, she felt a flicker of hope. "We'll rebuild," she said softly, more to herself than to Sarah or Sonny. "It won't be the same, but we'll make it home again." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Together," she affirmed. Sonny barked, as if in agreement, his tail wagging despite the somber surroundings. As they made their way back to the bus that would take them to temporary housing, Evelyn's mind was already turning to the future. There would be insurance claims to file, decisions to make about rebuilding, a community to help piece back together. The road ahead would be long and difficult. But as she boarded the bus, Sonny at her heels and Sarah by her side, Evelyn felt a strength she didn't know she possessed. The fire had taken so much, but it had also revealed the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, and the unbreakable bonds of family, both human and canine. The bus pulled away from Oakridge Road, carrying its passengers towards an uncertain future. But as Evelyn watched the sun setting over the scarred landscape, she knew that this was not an end, but a beginning. From the ashes of devastation, new life would grow. And she, along with Sonny, Sarah, and her entire community, would be there to nurture it. The weeks following the devastating wildfire were a blur of activity for the residents of Redwood. As the shock of the disaster began to fade, the community's focus shifted from immediate survival to the daunting task of rebuilding. Amidst the chaos of insurance claims, temporary housing arrangements, and the first tentative steps towards reconstruction, a spark of something positive began to emerge. It started with a simple post on the local community forum. Someone shared the story of how Sunny, Evelyn's golden retriever, had played a crucial role in their rescue during the evacuation. The post quickly gained traction, with others chiming in with their own stories of heroism and kindness they had witnessed during the crisis. Before long, the idea of a community event to honor these everyday heroes began to take shape. The mayor, seeing an opportunity to boost morale and bring the community together, threw her support behind the initiative. A committee was formed, and plans for a Redwood Heroes celebration were set in motion. Evelyn was taken aback when she received a call from the mayor's office, inviting her and Sunny to be guests of honor at the event. "But we didn't do anything special," she protested, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. "Mrs. Matthews," the mayor's assistant said gently, "your story has inspired so many people. It's not just about what you and Sunny did during the fire. It's about the resilience and spirit you've shown in its aftermath. People need something to celebrate right now, and your bond with Sunny represents the best of our community." After some coaxing from Sarah and encouragement from her neighbors, Evelyn reluctantly agreed to participate. As the day of the celebration approached, she found herself growing increasingly nervous. Sunny, on the other hand, seemed to sense the excitement in the air and was more energetic than ever. The morning of the event dawned bright and clear, a welcome change from the smoke-filled skies of recent weeks. The local park, which had miraculously been spared from the fire, had been transformed. Colorful banners hung from trees, local food trucks lined the perimeter, and a stage had been set up at one end of the grassy field. As Evelyn arrived with Sarah and Sunny, she was amazed by the turnout. It seemed like the entire town had shown up, along with news crews from the surrounding areas. Children ran around with face paint and balloons, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and music, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that had pervaded the community in recent weeks. "Evelyn, over here," called a familiar voice. Evelyn turned to see Mrs. Garcia waving at her, surrounded by a group of their neighbors from Oak Ridge Road. As Evelyn made her way over, she was enveloped in hugs and warm greetings. Sunny basked in the attention, his tail wagging furiously as he received pets and scratches from everyone. "You look wonderful, dear," Mrs. Garcia said, squeezing Evelyn's hand. "And Sunny, don't you look handsome?" The golden retriever was sporting a new red bandana for the occasion, a gift from Sarah. As they chatted, catching up on their progress with insurance claims and rebuilding plans, Evelyn felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Jake, the young firefighter who had been so instrumental in their rescue, standing there in his dress uniform. "Mrs. Matthews," he said with a smile, "I'm glad you could make it." "You too, Sunny," he added, bending down to give the dog a pat. "Jake, it's good to see you," Evelyn replied warmly. "How have you been?" "Busy," he admitted with a rueful smile. "But it's good work. Seeing the community come together like this, it makes all those long nights worth it." Before they could chat further, an announcement came over the loudspeakers asking all Hanores to gather near the stage. Evelyn felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but Sarah gave her an encouraging smile. "You've got this," her sister said. "Just remember, everyone here is on your side." As Evelyn made her way to the stage with Sunny at her side, she was struck by the diversity of the group gathered there. There was old Mr. Johnson, who had used his ham radio to coordinate rescues when the cell towers went down. The Thompson twins, barely out of high school, who had helped evacuate the local animal shelter. Dr. Patel, who had worked tirelessly at the evacuation center to care for the injured and ill. The mayor, a tall woman with a shock of silver hair, stepped up to the microphone. "Good afternoon, Redwood," she began, her voice ringing out across the park. "We're gathered here today not just to celebrate our survival, but to honor the extraordinary acts of courage, kindness, and community spirit that saw us through our darkest hours." As the mayor spoke about the resilience of their town and the long road of rebuilding ahead, Evelyn found herself overcome with emotion. Looking out at the sea of faces, friends, neighbors, strangers all bound together by their shared experience, she felt a profound sense of gratitude and belonging. One by one, the heroes were called up to receive recognition. When it was Evelyn and Sunny's turn, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Sunny, ever the ham, pranced up to the stage as if he'd been waiting for this moment all his life. Evelyn Matthews and her loyal companion, Sunny, the mayor announced, showed us the true meaning of courage and devotion. Their harrowing escape from the fire and Sunny's instrumental role in alerting rescuers have become a symbol of hope for our community. As Evelyn accepted a plaque and Sunny was presented with a special doggy medal, which was really just a fancy dog biscuit, she felt compelled to say something. Taking the microphone with shaky hands, she looked out at the crowd. I'm not much for public speaking, she began hesitantly, but I want to thank you all. Sunny and we didn't do anything that any of you wouldn't have done. The real heroes are the firefighters, the first responders, and each and every one of you who reached out to help your neighbors in need. She paused, gathering her thoughts. We lost so much in the fire. Homes, possessions, memories. But standing here today, I'm reminded of what we didn't lose. Our spirit. Our sense of community. Our ability to come together and support each other in times of crisis. Sunny, sensing the emotion in her voice, pressed closer to her side. Evelyn reached down to scratch behind his ears, drawing strength from his presence. As we rebuild, she continued, her voice growing stronger, let's remember this feeling. Let's hold on to this sense of unity and purpose. Because together, there's nothing we can't overcome. As she finished speaking, the park erupted in applause. Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she and Sunny made their way back to their seats, buoyed by the warmth and support of their community. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of music, food, and conversation. Children laughed as they played games organized by local volunteers. Neighbors who had lost touch over the years reconnected, sharing stories of their experiences during and after the fire. Plans for rebuilding were discussed, ideas were shared, and a sense of hope began to take root. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Evelyn found a quiet moment to reflect. She sat on a bench at the edge of the festivities, Sunny dozing at her feet. Sarah joined her, handing her a cup of lemonade. You did great up there, Sarah said, bumping her shoulder against Evelyn's. I'm proud of you, sis. Evelyn smiled, taking a sip of her drink. Thanks. I meant what I said, you know. About us all being in this together. Sarah nodded, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I know. And I think everyone here feels the same way. It's like, the fire burned away all the little differences and disagreements. What's left is what really matters. As if to punctuate her words, a group of children ran by, laughing as they chased each other. Among them was Jake's young daughter, her face painted like a butterfly, clutching a balloon shaped like a fire truck. Life goes on, Evelyn mused, watching the children play. Even after something like this. It does, Sarah agreed. And we'll be there to see it. To be part of it. As the celebration wound down and people began to head home, there was a palpable sense of renewal in the air. The path ahead would not be easy, there were still homes to rebuild, lives to piece back together, and a landscape to heal. But the spirit of community that had been strengthened in the face of adversity would light the way forward. Evelyn, Sarah, and Sunny walked home under a sky painted with the warm hues of sunset. The scars of the fire were still visible on the horizon, but they no longer seemed as daunting. With each step, with each wag of Sunny's tail, with each shared smile between the sisters, a new chapter was beginning. The Redwood Heroes celebration had done more than honor the bravery of individuals. It had reaffirmed the strength of their community, the unbreakable bonds of friendship and neighborly love, and the resilience of the human and canine spirit. As Evelyn unlocked the door to their temporary apartment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before the fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new steps in the rebuilding process. But tonight, Evelyn, Sarah, and Sunny would rest easy, wrapped in the warmth of a community that had come together to celebrate life, loyalty, and the enduring power of hope. As the seasons changed and autumn gave way to winter, the landscape of Redwood began to transform. The charred remains of buildings were gradually cleared away, making room for new foundations to be laid. The bare, blackened trees that had stood as stark reminders of the fire's fury began to show the first tentative signs of new growth. And in the hearts of the town's residents, hope continued to flourish alongside the challenges of rebuilding their lives. For Evelyn, the months following the fire had been a whirlwind of activity. After weeks of wrangling with insurance companies and navigating the complexities of disaster relief programs, she had finally received the funds to begin rebuilding her home on Oakridge Road. The decision to rebuild hadn't been an easy one. The memories of that terrifying night still haunted her dreams, but in the end, the pull of home and community had won out. On a crisp December morning, Evelyn stood on her property, Sunny faithfully by her side, watching as the construction crew began work on the foundation of her new house. The plans called for a structure similar to her old family home, but with modern safety features and fire-resistant materials. It would be different, but it would still be home. "Well, Sunny," Evelyn said, scratching behind the golden retriever's ears, "what do you think? Ready for a new adventure?" Sunny wagged his tail and let out a soft woof of approval, his breath visible in the cool air. Evelyn smiled, drawing comfort from her loyal companion's unwavering support. "I thought you might say that," she chuckled. As she watched the workers pour the concrete for the foundation, Evelyn reflected on how far they'd come. The temporary apartment she and Sarah had shared in the months after the fire had been a blessing, but it had never felt like home. Sarah had recently found her own place, closer to the hospital where she worked, but the sisters remained as close as ever, speaking daily and meeting for dinner at least once a week. The sound of a car pulling up drew Evelyn from her thoughts. She turned to see Jake, the young firefighter who had become a good friend in the months since the fire, climbing out of his pickup truck. "Morning, Mrs. Matthews," he called, making his way over. "Sunny," he added with a grin, bending down to give the dog a pat. "How's it feel to see your new home starting to take shape?" Evelyn smiled warmly. "It feels right," she said after a moment's reflection. "A little scary, but mostly exciting. And please, Jake, I've told you 100 times, call me Evelyn." Jake laughed, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. "Old habits die hard, I guess. But I'll work on it. Evelyn." They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the construction crew at work. Jake had become a frequent visitor over the past months, often stopping by to check on Evelyn and Sunny, or to lend a hand with various tasks as the community rebuilt. His friendship had been an unexpected but welcome source of support. "How are things at the firehouse?" Evelyn asked, turning to face the young man. "I heard you were promoted to lieutenant." "Congratulations." Jake's face lit up with pride. "Thanks. It's been challenging, but in a good way. We've been focusing a lot on community outreach lately, fire safety workshops, that kind of thing. Trying to make sure we're better prepared if, God forbid, anything like this ever happens again." Evelyn nodded approvingly. "That's wonderful, Jake. I'm sure it means a lot to people, especially the kids, to see you all out there in the community." As they continued to chat, catching up on the latest town news and rebuilding efforts, Evelyn felt a familiar sense of gratitude wash over her. Despite all they had lost, the fire had brought out the best in their community, forging new friendships and strengthening old ones. The weeks and months that followed saw steady progress on Evelyn's new home. As winter melted into spring, the basic structure took shape, and Evelyn found herself visiting the construction site almost daily, often bringing coffee and donuts for the workers. Sunny became a familiar sight on the property, charming the construction crew with his friendly demeanor and occasionally helping by carrying small tools in his mouth. One sunny afternoon in late April, Evelyn arrived at the site to find Sarah waiting for her, a mischievous grin on her face. "What are you up to?" Evelyn asked suspiciously, knowing her sister's penchant for surprises. Sarah's grin widened. "Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd stop by and see how things were progressing. And maybe," she paused for dramatic effect, "give you a little housewarming gift." From behind her back, Sarah produced a small potted plant, a rose bush, its buds just beginning to open. Evelyn gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Sarah," she whispered, gently taking the pot. "It's beautiful. I thought we could plant it together," Sarah said softly. "A symbol of new beginnings." The sisters spent the next hour carefully planting the rose bush in a sunny spot near where the front porch would be. As they worked, They shared memories of their childhood home, of the gardens their mother had lovingly tended, and of the new memories they would create in this place. As spring blossomed into summer, Evelyn's house neared completion. The whole town seemed to be in a state of renewal. New buildings rose where old ones had stood, their fresh paint and modern designs a stark contrast to the few remaining burnt-out structures. The local park, which had hosted the Heroes celebration the previous year, was now a hub of activity, with new playground equipment and a memorial garden dedicated to those who had lost their lives in the fire. On a warm evening in early July, Evelyn stood in the driveway of her newly completed home, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. A welcome home banner hung from the porch, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of barbecue and the sound of laughter. Mrs. Garcia, her eyes twinkling, presented Evelyn with a hand-knitted afghan. "For those chilly nights," she said with a wink. "And to remind you that you're always wrapped in the love of your community." Jake and his fellow firefighters had pooled together to buy Evelyn a state-of-the-art fire safety system for the new house. "Not that we don't trust Sonny to keep you safe," Jake joked, "but a little extra protection never hurts." As the party continued into the evening, Evelyn found a quiet moment to slip away. She made her way to the backyard, Sonny following close behind. The rose bush that she and Sarah had planted was now in full bloom, its delicate pink flowers a stark contrast to the memory of ash and smoke. Evelyn took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet scent of the roses mixed with the earthy smell of new grass. She felt Sonny press against her leg and reached down to ruffle his fur. "We did it, boy," she said softly. "We're home." As if in response, Sonny gave a gentle woof and wagged his tail. In the distance, Evelyn could hear the sounds of the party: Sarah's laugh, Mrs. Garcia's animated storytelling, the clinking of glasses as neighbors toasted to new beginnings. The path to this moment had been long and often difficult. There had been days of despair when the task of rebuilding had seemed insurmountable. Nights when the memories of the fire had left Evelyn gasping for breath, clinging to Sonny for comfort. Moments of frustration dealing with bureaucracy and the slow pace of recovery. But there had also been countless acts of kindness. Neighbors helping neighbors. Strangers becoming friends. A community coming together to support one another in ways both big and small. Through it all, Sonny had been her constant companion, a source of unconditional love and support. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues reminiscent of that fateful night over a year ago, Evelyn felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The fire had taken so much, but it had also revealed the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the unbreakable bonds of community. She thought about the journey they had all been on, from the terror of evacuation to the grief of loss, from the tentative steps towards recovery to this moment of celebration. Each stage had brought its own challenges, but also its own lessons and moments of grace. The sound of footsteps on the new grass drew Evelyn from her reverie. She turned to see Sarah approaching, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. "Thought you might need a refreshment," Sarah said, handing a glass to Evelyn. "Everything okay?" Evelyn smiled, taking a sip of the cool drink. "Everything's perfect," she replied. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. How much has changed, and yet, how much remains the same." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The important things remain," she said softly. "Family, friends, community, and of course, this furry hero," she added, bending down to give Sonny a scratch. As they stood there in the gathering twilight, the sisters found themselves remembering all they had been through, the fear, the loss, the struggle to rebuild. But more than that, they remembered the moments of hope, the unexpected joys, and the strength they had found in each other and in their community. "You know," Evelyn said after a moment, "I think Mom and Dad would be proud. Of us, of this place, of how everyone came together." Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. "I think so too," she agreed. "They always said home was more than just a building. It's the people, the memories, the love. And we've got all of that in spades." As if on cue, Jake's voice called out from the front yard. "Evelyn. Sarah. You're missing the toast." The sisters exchanged a smile. "Shall we?" Sarah asked, gesturing towards the party. Evelyn nodded, giving Sonny a final pat. "Let's go. After all, we've got a lot to celebrate." Together, They made their way back to their friends and neighbors, to the warmth and laughter of the gathering. As Evelyn looked around at the faces of those who had become more than just neighbors, who had become a true community, she felt a surge of gratitude and hope. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, but Evelyn knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. With Sunny by her side, Sarah in her corner, and a community that had proven its strength and resilience, she was ready for whatever the future might hold. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Evelyn raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, she said, her voice carrying across the yard. To community, to resilience, and to the unbreakable bonds that see us through the darkest times. The gathering echoed her words, glasses clinking as Sunny barked his own approval. And in that moment, surrounded by love and the promise of tomorrow, Evelyn knew that they had not just rebuilt a house, they had reinforced the very foundations of home.